very welcome to the Royal Irish Academy for our day-long event on archives, access and human rights. Now, this is a subject that could absorb many days, and you will have noticed that the programme is very tight, so we're going to have to be careful about sticking to timings. This event originated in the Historical Studies Committee of the Academy due to perceived difficulties with access to some official records. A working group was established with me as chair, Mary O'Dowd, Lisa Godson, Maeve O'Rourke and Ciara Brannock representing the Academy, and Felix Larkin and Kelly Fitzgerald representing the Irish Committee for Historical Sciences. Ciara Brannock had to leave the working group in April, and we're grateful for her contribution. And Martha, as I said, programme manager here in the Academy, has been our stalwart administrator and advisor throughout the process. We set about organising a one-day event that would deal with state records, that's the records of government departments and agencies and local authorities in the morning, and the records of institutions like industrial schools, mother and baby homes and Magdalene Laundries, and the records of relevant commissions of inquiry in the afternoon. We managed to raise funding from Boston College, the Aaron's Project, the Irish Committee for Historical Sciences, Justice for Magdalene's Research, the Irish Commission for Human Rights, and the Archives and Records Association of Ireland. We're grateful to them all, and particularly to Boston College, who are our biggest sponsor. It's hard to raise funding when you're not attached to a university for an event like this, so we're pretty delighted that we managed to get there in the end, and we can actually give you a cup of coffee and sandwiches and all those things that people expect these days. Archives can be mysterious. People often don't know quite what they are. In the late 1980s, when the Prevention of Terrorism Act was in full swing, Irish people on trips to the UK were often stopped and had their luggage searched. On one such occasion, the nice customs officer, rifling through my deeply uninteresting bag, asked me what I did for a living. I told him I was an archivist, and he said, "Oh, an alchemist." I asked him if he knew what an alchemist was, and he didn't, so I enlightened him that it meant the capacity to turn base metal into gold. I assured him that if I possessed such skills, I would be busy enriching myself instead of hanging out in dirty basements trying to save the records of the state. But the point was, he knew the word alchemist, but not the word archivist. An activity which flourished unsuccessfully in the Middle Ages was more familiar to him than the work done by people working to preserve our historical record. Go figure. Archivists and archives are much better known now, partly because of the release of important records not previously seen, partly because of TV documentaries where members of our profession show fabulous documents to celebrities in search of their history, or eminent historians wishing to show us the primary sources underlying their research into an endless variety of topics, partly because of Tom Hanks running around the Vatican archives consulting ancient manuscripts in the Da Vinci Code movies, and of course, because of the contention surrounding the records of religious congregations who ran the institutions that we will be discussing this afternoon. There are two absences from today's proceedings which I have to tell you about. The first is that of Niamh Ní Cara, Chair of the Archives and Records Association of Ireland, the umbrella body which represents archivists, conservators and record managers. Very sadly, Niamh's father died unexpectedly on Saturday after a short illness, and she's unable to attend. We send our sincere condolences to her and her family in their time of grief and loss. Niamh, amazingly given her circumstances, has sent me her notes for her speech, and I will try to convey her thoughts as best I can. I beg your indulgence when I get to that point. The second absence is that of the National Archives of Ireland. As you can see from the programme, we have a very impressive lineup of archivists, historians, civil servants and human rights advocates. But of course, the National Archives was the first institution we invited to participate in this event, as they are responsible under statute for the records of the Irish state, including records of commissions of inquiry. The statute in question is the National Archives Act of 1986, which provides for the preservation of state archives and arrangements for access to them 30 years after their creation. A number of questions will be raised by two of our speakers this morning, Professor Maria Luddy and Dr. Kieran Casey, which need to be answered by the National Archives. These questions relate to failure to transfer records to the archives and failure to safeguard them properly in their places of origin, closure of records already transferred to the archives, and difficulties with records like those of mental hospitals, which fall outside the purview of the National Archives Act, which for many years was supposed to be amended to include government agencies like the HSE, who are responsible for mental hospital records, but has only been amended to copy the British rule change for access to certain state records after 20 years. A lot of energy has gone into adapting to that particular amendment. The National Archives is also the lead agency with responsibility to the archives, for the archives to be deposited in whatever format in the proposed Centre for Research and Remembrance at the old Magdalene Laundry in Sean McDermott St. The Centre is a government initiative resulting from the need for memorialisation of people who suffered in the various institutions since the foundation of the state. All kinds of questions arise regarding what archives will be deposited there. Crucially, will the records of the congregations which ran these institutions be there, and not just the personal records of survivors and inmates, but also administrative records that give us the context for what was going on? Where are these records now? What kind of access will be provided to them? Will survivors' wishes about access to their records be respected? The director of the National Archives, Orla McBride, wrote back to our invitation to join us on the 4th of October last year. I'm going to quote parts of her reply because I think you deserve to know the reasons why the state agency that is responsible for these records is not here today. She begins by dealing with the long-standing chronic storage problems at NAI, the National Archives, which have prevented records being taken in for decades. And I quote, "Plans were developed some years back to develop a new archive repository on the site here at Bishop Street to address the legacy challenges in relation to storage capacity. It is now anticipated that works on this ambitious project will commence later this year." That was late 2023. This is a 65-week build, and there is therefore a high degree of confidence that the issues in relation to space will be significantly resolved by 2025. Given our experience with the Children's Hospital and various other public infrastructure projects, I think that's very optimistic. On the transfer of records from government departments, the National Archives continues to accession annual transfers from many government departments despite space challenges. The 20-year rule necessitated that records falling under this amendment from 1993 to 2003 transferred from the Department of Foreign Affairs, the Department of the Taoiseach, the Department of Justice and the Office of the Attorney General, which are the only 4 departments that have consistently transferred records to the National Archives over about the last 20 years, more perhaps. By the end of this year, all relevant files falling under the 20-year rule will have been transferred with annual transfers thereafter. The National Archives also continues to receive annual transfers from a range of other government departments and agencies on an annual basis. Details of these are included in our annual reports. Planning is underway towards the transfer of all historical backlogs once the new repository is ready. With regard to your invitation to speak to your event on, quote, space difficulties and proposed solutions, our capital project will attend to this and is already in train. We now have clarity in relation to a timeline and anticipated completion date. I hope this positive update is of interest to Royal Irish Academy members. End quote. She goes on to deal with the National Centre for Research and Remembrance, for which the National Archives is tasked with taking the lead on archival matters. Quote, "In relation to the highly sensitive issue of the National Centre for Research and Remembrance, the National Archives is working with relevant government departments and agencies on the transfer of records relating to institutional trauma which fall under the National Archives Act of 1986. An initial audit has been carried out across all relevant departments, and we are working closely with them to begin to prepare the records for transfer. As you know, there are legal issues relating to many of the records you have identified. Those records are the records of the religious congregations. And these issues are being examined by a legal and legislative subgroup established under the process. At present, the National Archives can only work on departmental records that fall under the 30-year rule." End quote. The legal and legislative subgroup to which she refers is a constituent part of the steering group for the Centre for Research and Remembrance, which is overwhelmingly composed of people from government departments. I think there is now one survivor representative on that steering committee, and that is the great Patricia Carey, who has just been appointed the advocate for survivors. Back to Orla again. In relation to the National Centre, the National Archives is working within a 5-year window in terms of the centre opening in a process led by the Department of Children, Disability, Equality, Integration and Youth. The work we are undertaking now with departments is on departmental records over 30 years old relevant to the National Centre that will transfer to the National Archives in time. In your email, you refer to the interest of historians in the files of the Commissions of Investigation into Industrial Schools and Mother and Baby Homes and the Interdepartmental Committee of Inquiry into Magdalene Laundries. These currently fall outside of our statutory responsibility until issues relating to access and transfer before 30 years are resolved in the context of the work of the legal and legislative subgroup. Any files relating to individuals that will transfer to the National Centre will also be subject to GDPR. Access arrangements will therefore have a legal basis to reflect this. End quote. Now, there are some useful pieces of information in this letter. We're all very glad, I'm sure, to hear that the long-expected new building will be in existence by next year, perhaps. That will help with getting records long overdue for transfer into the archives. It's useful to know that there is a 5-year timeline for the Centre for Research and Remembrance. It's useful to know that decisions about congregational records seem to lie with the legal and legislative subgroup of the steering committee. It would have been even more useful to have the director or some of the excellent staff in the National Archives come here today to tell us in person about what they are doing and to answer questions. We hope that possible future iterations of today's event will include representatives from the archives. Our door is always open. There was very recently an announcement that the National Museum and the National Archives will be commencing an in-person consultation process with survivors concerning the National Centre. Survivors can register to be part of these meetings. That is welcome news. It's meant to happen later in the summer. Now, Niamh Ní Cara had intended to talk about advocacy as part of her opening address. Advocacy can mean support for the release of closed records, objections to restrictive legislation on archives, support for greater resources for archives organisations, campaigns to educate people about the importance of archives, dire warnings about the digital disaster awaiting us if something is not done to safeguard born digital records, and lastly but not least, support for people who need access to archives and are being denied them. I now try to read Niamh's notes to you in the hope that I can do justice to the work that she did before the sad loss of her father. She begins by outlining her objectives in her speech, quote, "To represent archivists and highlight the challenges and obstacles we're faced with, to understand better those of researchers seeking to access archives, and to highlight both the importance of advocacy in the archive profession and the need for our sister professions and all users to advocate on our behalf. At the end of the day, it is simple. Ensuring and improving access to archives is intrinsically linked to advocacy in all its various forms." End quote. She goes on to outline the challenges facing archivists, front-facing and behind the scenes, and to tell us what the ideal outcome of today's event would be for her. Quote, "Archivists are often the face of archives. We're the first point of contact and sometimes the last. We know material, we can advise researchers on what to check out, and we're often the one to have processed it. So we're most likely the person to deal directly with those seeking access. So front-facing challenges include often having to say no, but please don't shoot the messenger. Reasons for saying no can include records were never transferred, were destroyed, were incomplete, lacked arrangement, were still not processed, or closed to adhere to legislation which is often outdated. Lack of trust because of decisions at management and government level. Archivists under pressure, understaffed, under-resourced, underfunded, dealing with unlisted material, etc. The complexity and scale of work often not understood by users, including sister professions. Trauma, a major factor, dealing with sensitive material and dealing with sensitive issues with users on a cumulative basis, often not understood by superiors and no mental health checks provided. Profession often not recognised as such. We're trained to appraise material with a host of issues in mind, including legislation, and to make the necessary decisions. We have a code of ethics. We are separate from the history profession, and unlike the early days of our profession, we serve not just historians, but society at large. We take that very seriously. Behind the scenes challenges, often there's only one archivist covering a vast amount of material. Constrained by lack of resources, money and time and equipment. Constrained by legislation that is seriously out of date, often the only archivist in an institution that doesn't understand the work, government over-promising with unrealistic timetables and then they don't listen when we flag it, material lost, destroyed or incomplete before it ever gets to the archivist, working in unsuitable buildings, not protected by whistleblowers legislation, lack of appreciation for costs and time related to digitisation, which is often not always therefore possible. It's not a magic wand. Sole archivists, often working in the same institution for decades, not always supported with professional development. The archives profession is continuously evolving and at the cutting edge of the fight for human rights. Not all archivists are up to date on this way of thinking or supported in it. Records being generated now, which will become the archives of the future, are often not being managed properly. We need, therefore, to advocate for proper records management and hiring of records managers across all bodies, tribunals, institutions, etc. And then she lists the ideal outcomes for archivists today. That the sheer scale of the work facing archivists is understood. That the terrifyingly inadequate lack of resources is understood and the effect that this has on deliverables appreciated. That rather than seeing us perhaps as part of the system blocking access, that you advocate alongside us for records to be preserved and proper resources put in place, including hiring qualified professional archivists to ensure material is both preserved and made accessible where appropriate. If fighting for records of an institution to be made accessible, advocate as part of that for the records to be preserved, processed by a qualified archivist, housed in an appropriate location and future-proofed. If what is promised is only the first of these, the records will never become accessible. Understand that archivists are often activists too and need your support. We're not gatekeepers, we're not the obstruction. We often have very valid reasons for holding material back, usually legislation, or are as frustrated or exasperated as you when records we feel should be made available are blocked through no fault of ours. End quote. She goes on to give us some interesting facts and statistics regarding local authority archives in Ireland. So, quote, there are 21 qualified local authority archivists working across the Republic of Ireland. It has taken approximately 20 years to reach this number, and it has never been surpassed. Less than 1/4 of archivists in post are employed at grade 7. That's the local government grade at which archivists are employed. All others are employed at grade 6 or 5. This is true even when they are heads of services and when they work across several counties. All are required to hold a postgraduate qualification. By way of comparison, biodiversity officers are now employed in almost 100% of local authorities. The filling of these roles happened over the course of the last 2 years. All biodiversity officers are employed at grade 7. There is no requirement for a postgraduate qualification for this post. The point she's making there is the downgrading of perception of archivists and the work that they do across local government. And that is something we've all known about for some time. Some more statistics. Only 1/4 of services have more than one archivist. Approximately 50% are fully responsible for records management, digital preservation, act as data protection officers and deal with all FOI requests. The other 50% are obstructed from decision-making regarding records management. Approximately 1/3 are managed under corporate services with no connection to public service or libraries. The other 2/3 are managed under libraries or in conjunction with heritage and museum services. There is no consistent approach to the status or profile of archive services in local government. There is no local authority archivist working in a purpose-built facility. The Local Government Management Agency, the LGMA, is the body that supports local government services and sectors. In 2023, funding for library development was over 1.2 million. There is no funding stream for local authority archive services from the LGMA. In 2023, the LGMA published its public library strategy. In all 456 pages, the word archives is mentioned only once in reference to local studies. There's no clear understanding of the landscape archivists are dealing with. Local Government Archives and Records Management is a voluntary group consisting of archivists who support colleagues dealing with complex situations. This group is not funded by LGMA or from any other source. Neither is the group asked to report to the LGMA on matters handled by archivists. Some of the issues that are handled by archivists in post include removal of civic records to the ownership of newly created bodies like Irish Water, liaising with government departments over the establishment of the National Centre for Research and Remembrance and the Mother and Baby Homes redress schemes, record management and digital preservation of authentic records in local authorities, appraisal and retention guidelines for the LGMA and the County and City Management Association, handling of historic records in closed organisations, e.g. unlawful destruction, where somewhere closes down and there's a danger of these records being destroyed, people have to move in. Access to records of trauma and sensitive records, born digital records and digital preservation with the Digital Repository of Ireland, electoral registers, national projects, and provision of access to records dating back to the 12th century. Besides temporarily funded projects, no local government archive services in Ireland employ staff members who can be found on special collections and archives teams in other organisations, e.g. our universities. Conservators of any kind, digital humanities developers, engagement officers, genealogists, cartographic photographic artwork officers, photographers, digitisation officers, publishing assistants, copyright assistants, digital support officers, digital archivists, digital preservation managers, and spaces and facilities not available in local authority archives, teaching spaces, discrete moving rooms, and remote consultation digital equipment. None of these roles and facilities are unusual in local government archives in the UK. Provision of services varies wildly across local authorities. In some counties, senior management has not made provision for reading rooms or facilities to be resourced. In other counties, reading rooms are so heavily used that no other behind-the-scenes project work is possible. For example, one service, Dublin, answered over 1,200 inquiries in the first quarter of 2024. In other counties, this number is under 100 over 1 year. Some services are closed to researchers as there is no archivist. In thinking how to improve access, ask this question. How much time that's directed to historians and academics, willing to spend learning about the landscape within which archivists operate in order to advocate for change? Archive services in Ireland are not only chronically underfunded, they are chronically undermined by the organisations within which they operate. End quote. And I should say here that Niamh Brennan, who's Donegal County Archivist, is joining us here this morning to tell us about access to records in her archives. So we'll get an in-depth look at how things work in an actual functioning county archives, and that will further enhance our understanding of local authority archives. Niamh, at the end of her notes, mentions the Irish Community for Trauma-Informed Archival Practice, a relatively new and very welcome group, which is, quote, an initiative of archivists to provide peer support to the archival community in Ireland working with records and researchers relating to trauma. A committee has been established to provide strategic direction and guidance to the Irish archival community on issues relevant to this area of archival practice. The initiative is not driven by one organisation or individual and is intended as a practical forum for archival practitioners working in this area, end quote. A very important step for archivists who may be dealing with people who have been traumatised by their treatment in the past and may be re-traumatised by long-sought access for the records of that mistreatment. The Archives and Records Association of Ireland, of which Niamh is chair, issued a statement in 2020 about the Commission of Investigation, Mother and Baby Homes and Certain Related Matters, Records and Another Matter, Bill of 2020. Will we ever get short titles for Irish legislation? It goes on forever. She would have made reference to it, so I'll read excerpts to you now from it. We wish to express our concern about the lack of consultation, consideration and inclusivity in passing the Commission of Investigation Bill. I won't read the whole thing again. We welcome the government's subsequent acknowledgement of the hurt this has caused to victims and survivors of abuse and its commitment to working with the Data Protection Commission and other legal experts in relation to accessibility. We also welcome further reference to management and preservation of the records of the Commission. We feel this continues to fall far short in terms of addressing concerns around access and information governance, archives and records management, data protection and digital preservation of the Archive of the Mother and Baby Homes Commission. They call for a full and fundamental overview of the bill. They have big issues with TUSLA, the Child and Family Agency, being the people who have access to original records with which to advise, if that's the word for it, survivors. And they're worried about the fact that these records may be locked away for a long time. On this basis, we urge the Minister for Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth to engage in further dialogue with survivors of abuse and their representatives, as well as with the National Archives Advisory Council, yet to be appointed, I might say, the Minister for Media, Tourism, Arts, Culture, Sport and the Gaeltacht, who has statutory responsibility for the National Archives, and the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform. This is a defining moment for the state in its treatment of survivors of abuse. It is vital that access, management and preservation of their testimony and the important records and work of the Commission are considered at greater length so that those most directly impacted are supported and society and future generations can attest to this period in our history, and the date of that is the 29th of October 2020. End quote. What is impressive about this statement is its placement of survivors at the centre of its complaint and its proposals for change. ARA Ireland has many campaigns to its credit. In this one, it is tacitly acknowledging a human rights emphasis in its appeal to the government. There was no response from the government to this statement. Niamh has given us a lot to think about. That's the end of her notes, and I'm very grateful to her at a time of huge bereavement for making the effort to send these on so that you could hear what she had to say today. She's enlarged our understanding of the archival landscape and the difficulties faced by practitioners, particularly those working in local authority archives who are very poorly resourced. I want to finish with some words about the human rights dimension of our discussions today. Just checking the time. Yep. How do archives relate to human rights? How does lack of access to archives affect human rights? Are the rights so affected individual, collective, or both? What are the areas here in Ireland that need addressing with regard to archival human rights? Archives can often have a direct bearing on the rights of individuals and communities who have been harmed. Two examples that everyone will remember are the records of the British administration in Kenya during the Mau Mau Rebellion in the 1950s, when many people were incarcerated and tortured, and the Stasi records, the archive of the East German secret police and their many informants, which was beautifully dramatised in the 2006 film The Lives of Others. Both of these releases were controversial. Those who perpetrated atrocities in Kenya and those involved in intimate surveillance in the GDR, anxious that they be kept closed. The release of the Kenyan records allowed elderly victims to sue in the British courts for compensation for their suffering. The release of the Stasi records allowed individuals to see their own files and know who had been spying on them. So both sets of records were important for the vindication of the human rights of those with whom they dealt. The right to be recompensed for atrocity and the right to view knowledge held by the state about people without their consent. But they are also important for the right of societies to understand accurately and with evidence who they are and were. The British imperial racist project in Africa and a paranoid autocratic government in East Germany. Even if this right is not codified by the UN, it should be part of a basic understanding of citizens' appropriate expectations of accurate knowledge of how their countries are governed. The same principles apply to the ongoing so-called legacy dispute in Northern Ireland. It's essential that victims and their families get access to any records currently withheld that can allow them to discover what happened to their loved ones, and just as importantly, how and why. There's a growing international focus on human rights advocacy on the part of archivists. Archives and Human Rights, a book published in 2021 under the auspices of the International Council on Archives, which is the worldwide body for archivists, contains a set of essays on the importance of archives in prosecuting and investigating human rights violations and in various truth and reconciliation processes. The countries covered range from Colombia to Rwanda to East Germany to Cambodia to Chile to Brazil and many more. David Fricker, president of the International Council on Archives, writes in the preface, quote, ICA recognises that archives contain the evidence upon which the defence of human rights can be prosecuted. The role of the archivist, therefore, is vital. All archivists should understand how, while acting within legal and regulatory frameworks, we can contribute to the development of societies that are just, inclusive and egalitarian. As archivists, we should ensure that archives exist as authentic evidence of administrative, cultural and intellectual activities, and moreover, that this invaluable resource will continue to advance a rights-based society for all, end quote. That is the man responsible for the worldwide body on archives. The passage of the National Archives Act of 1986 was a landmark event for citizens' rights to see the records, which laid out how our country was governed and administered up to 30 years before. The flowering of 20th century history writing following the Act was an obvious proof of its value. Growing digitisation of large quantities of records, particularly large data sets, encouraged more scrutiny and discovery. Archives were democratised in a way unimaginable a decade before. The growth and professionalism of our local authority archives have greatly added to the resources available. Specialist areas like local, labour, architectural and military history have their own archival repositories, some better supported than others. The archival landscape has improved immeasurably since I began to work as an archivist in the mid-1970s. Our recent decade of centenaries led to the release of significant collections of records not seen before, dealing with the period from 1912 to 1923, the third Home Rule Bill to the end of the Civil War, with many huge anniversaries in between, bearing on the foundation myths, creation and establishment of the Irish state, as well as the First World War, which killed and injured far more people than the various nationalist conflicts. The records of the Bureau of Military History and the Military Service Pensions have given us an archive for our so-called revolutionary period unparalleled in most countries, and they provided a lot of people with answers about their relatives' lives during this turbulent history. And though they deal with some dreadful atrocities and a terrible civil war, our citizens were able to handle them and were grateful for access to them. The human rights violated during that period were many, and it was no harm to understand that we ourselves played a part in those violations. The sky did not fall on our heads as a result of the release of these archives, and I see that we have here with us today my old friend Cecile Gordon, who is the manager of the Military Service Pensions Project, one of the great jewels in the crown of Irish archives, hopefully to be finished properly before the whole thing comes to an end. But the most important archives dealing with the most vulnerable people in our society, those of the religious congregations which operated industrial schools, mother and baby homes and Magdalene Laundries, remain largely closed to both survivors and scholars. Adult adopted people who have fought for decades to get access to their own identity records were finally successful with the passage of the Birth Information and Tracing Act 2022, which has provided many with essential details of their birth, identity, and details of their early lives where available. But they are not given their medical records without going through their GP. The information given is not properly referenced with its origin, and very often there are redactions or obviously missing pages. There have been very long delays in getting the information. While it's really welcome that adopted persons so shamefully excluded from the remit of the Mother and Baby Homes Commission of Investigation have now got access to their identity records, it took too long. Subject access requests to the Department of Children provide information to mothers who are resident in these homes. The relevant archives are held by TUSA, the Child and Family Agency, but we do not know what they are, where they are, whether they are properly stored and conserved, whether they have been digitised. This afternoon we will be discussing the records of these institutions, beginning with Dr. Maeve O'Rourke talking about the human rights implications or lack of access to them. Archivists Wesley Geddes and Joy Carey from the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland will talk about their archival work for the Northern Ireland Truth Recovery Programme, an innovative process which should be of great interest to us. It's interesting for us to look at what is happening in the north in terms of going over some of the ground already covered here in the south, and the fact that they're seeing things through a very serious human rights lens. It makes a big difference to how everything proceeds. Laura McGarrigle, Assistant Secretary at the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth, will talk about the National Centre for Research and Remembrance and archival preparations for it. We are very grateful to Laura for joining us, especially in the absence of the National Archives. And last, Claire McGettrick, born Lorraine Hughes, co-founder of the Clon Project, will talk about the archival importance of survivor testimony. I want to extend a particular welcome to our friends from the north, where, as I said, they are operating in a different framework to anything we've done down here. Because the programme is so packed, we will have short Q&A sessions at the end of the morning and the end of the afternoon. We wanted to fit in as many interesting speakers as we could, and unfortunately, audience participation has to be curtailed as a result. We hope that there'll be further iterations of this event in the future, with more opportunities for audience interaction. Today, I beg that you ask questions rather than make speeches to allow maximum participation. There will be a glass of wine after the event that will allow informal conversation with speakers and our eminent chairs. I hope all of us leave today with an enhanced understanding of the importance of access to many different kinds of records, and particularly those which bear on individual identity information, and a commitment to encourage that access in any way we can. To adapt Roy Foster's famous remark in the 1980s, we are all advocates now. Thanks for your attention.